So 20 years ago, that was the year 1996. And probably you remember 1996, for those of you who grew wheat in 96, that was an epidemic year in terms of Fusarium head blight infection and DON toxin in the wheat in Ontario. And I think the same case was true in Michigan as well. So we're going to talk about 1996, and then we're going to review the top best management practices. I have a top 10, but I have, I think, 13 altogether. Best management practices. What have we learned in 20 years? So 1996, 20 years ago, what have we learned in 20 years? And so we're going to be talking about those kinds of things. So Ridgetown, just, I should have had this in my first talk, but just about an hour east of Detroit. 1996, this was an example of a sample of grain that was harvested from a field in 1996. Just horrendous looking, right? And I'm sorry, but you've just ate your lunch, and to a wheat grower, this would almost cause some kind of a reaction. So I'll just go on to the next slide there. So in 1996, this was our story in southwestern Ontario, at least. And so this purple area represents DON toxin in grain above 5 parts per million, which is very high. So anything above 5 is very high. And so we did a number of surveys, hundreds of fields were surveyed in 1996, and we continued those surveys for a number of years, but 1996 was that epidemic year. We saw this disease in the crop. The wheat crop could not be sold, the grain could not be sold on a lot of fields, so that grain was either thrown back into the field and plowed under, or in many cases, that grain was just taken to the dump because it was harvested and no one would want it. So it was like, how do you compost like thousands and thousands of bushels? And so some of that went to a dump, unfortunately. Now there's much better ways, of course, to use infected grain, and we'll talk about that maybe some other time. So let's talk about Fusarium management, head blight management then and now. So now we have much better cultivars. So in 1999, for instance, we had most of our cultivars in Ontario were the highly susceptible in the highly susceptible category, a few less in the susceptible, but very few moderately resistant. So 10% of our varieties in 1999 were moderately resistant. And then in 2008, the number of highly susceptible varieties decreased, number of moderately resistant increased. And then in 2015, very important to note, is that the number of highly susceptible varieties in Ontario 2015 dropped to 0. So there were no varieties that were highly susceptible that were registered that could be grown in Ontario. And I think that's the same trend in Michigan as well. You see very few highly susceptible in Michigan now compared to back in the 1990s. And so this is a very good trend. And the plant breeders need to be given credit toward this, and various funding agencies to fund those plant breeders as well, and just the encouragement that Fusarium head blight is a very important thing in addition to yield and some other factors as well. So number 2, so varieties are number 1, I think. Number 1, improvement. Number 2 is fungicide. So we have the advent of the triazole fungicides about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, I guess, at least registered for use. And so we have a triazole fungicide. So this is the application right at heading time. So day +3, day 0 in Ontario, we call day 0 as, when 75% of the heads emerge, we call that day 0. It's just like a benchmark time for Fusarium head blight fungicide application. So this is 3 days after the heads have emerged. And so we just think, to growers in Ontario at least, this day 0 is a very good visual point in time, very good benchmark in time. And so spraying 3 days afterwards, we found that that is one of the most efficacious time for fungicide application. So you can see some bleaching of the wheat heads here, even with a fungicide application, our best fungicide, using our best fungicide technology, application technology, applied at the right timing, perfect timing. Still we get some heads that are infected with Fusarium head blight. But you compare that with untreated. Untreated, we have more than much infection in the untreated. And that can make a huge difference in terms of its marketable value and the quality at harvest time. So do fungicides have a role? of course, they have a role, very important role in managing Fusarium head blight. So in 1996, we did not have fungicides that did even a reasonably good job. They fared a poor job at controlling or suppressing Fusarium head blight. The fungicides that we have today, like Crumba, Procero, Proline, those kinds of fungicides are much better.
On that screen,
Yep.
how many heads percentage-wise do you think are still showing some sign of the disease in your left foliage?
And so usually
5%?
Yeah, in this case, we have about 50% severity. So more than 50% of the kernels, like if you looked at all the heads and all the kernels on each head, 50% of the kernels, more than 50% of the kernels are infected. And then a fungicide application, we can safely say with a lot of research that we can reduce that amount by at least a half. And so it could go down from 50% infection to 25. And so if you were spraying for weeds and you only got 50% control due to a herbicide, you would say that herbicide is just junk, right? But it's not junk when you look at the reduction of the control that you get with the reduction that you get with a triazole fungicide. It could make the difference between a high quality crop, deliverable crop, and something that's not worth delivering at all. So that fungicide could be very important. So that's number 2. The number 3 is a combination of the two, and of course we have fungicide or cultivar differences here. So this is the scale on the bottom here is DON toxin in parts per million, and we have the different varieties here that we have in our variety trials, and so this is in 2013. So every year in Ontario and in Michigan as well, we have pockets that have environments favorable for Fusarium head blight infection. So 2013 was one of them in Ontario, and I just made these variety names fairly small, so it's not the variety names that I want you to look at. It's just the differences across all of these varieties in terms of how much DON toxin they produce, okay? And so these are the highly susceptible varieties, the varieties that are really favor that accumulation of DON toxin. As you can see, like some of these varieties, up to 4 parts per million, then we have one here over 8 parts per million. Whereas if you grew these varieties without a fungicide, you can get levels of parts per million below 2 parts per million, which is okay. It's a good start. And so variety choice, huge impact, Fusarium head blight management. But what is the number one variety factor that growers use to select a variety these days? And I'm guilty of that as well as a wheat grower. So what is that number one factor? Yield. Yield trumps everything. Okay, so you get a good variety that comes out and it out yields everything. Well, a lot of growers would want to grow that variety, and that variety though could be highly susceptible or susceptible. So there's some trade-offs. And so I've been fooled as a grower myself. You know, I want high yields, I want high profitability, but that means that we're going to have to sharpen our pencil in terms of managing that variety if that variety is highly susceptible or susceptible to Fusarium head blight. So there's always a trade-off, it seems, and that's why I love farming so much, because we can manage it. It's just not, we can't just follow a recipe approach and expect a good yield and quality product at the end of the day. It requires lots of thinking and knowledge and integrated management. And integrated management is needed for Fusarium head blight. So these are those same variety readings, but with Fusarium fungicide. So we have, I think we used Procero in these trials, and you can see just the reduction of the DON with an application of Procero at the right timing, at approximate timing for each of these varieties. So we don't get a huge reduction, you know, in DON toxin in some of these varieties. So look at this variety right here. So it didn't see very much DON toxin at all. But because we can't time the fungicide, you know, perfectly according to these varieties when they head in the trials, that is another problem that we have with these trials, because we just have one shot to apply a fungicide across all of these varieties. And some of these varieties head earlier than the others, and so maybe we might be putting some of these varieties at a disadvantage because we're not optimizing the timing for each one of these varieties. But you can do that in the field at least. You can see when the optimum heading date is in the field and spray accordingly, okay? So, but reduction in DON toxin, so we can expect, roughly 50% reduction in DON toxin with an appropriately sprayed fungicide. So number 3, we recognize this as a very important tool right here. So this is in the top 3, and that is combining the management with good variety selection and with a fungicide application at heading time. So we have a very good moderately resistant variety. We have DON here about 0.7 parts per million, whereas if we didn't apply a fungicide here in a highly susceptible variety, our parts per million is 5 times more than the moderately resistant with a fungicide applied. So the combination, it's just like a 1-2 punch. Grow a good variety, and then apply a fungicide to it, and we get 5 times, or a reduction in DON by 80%, 75%. That is a great management strategy. That is an integrated pest management strategy by using 2 factors, good genetics and a fungicide application. And so that's why this is a number 3, because of that synergistic reaction, all right? So if we did that in 1996, so these are all simulated versus we developed a model in Ontario to predict this DON toxin. And so if we took the weather from 1996, so this is a slide that I showed you a few moments ago showing high levels, that's purple, showing high levels of DON. If we used a simulated, moderately resistant cultivar in this prediction model, the map of Ontario could look something like this, so a little bit less purpling. And if we just simulate a fungicide application, the map would look like this, so a really good fungicide. If that fungicide was available back in 1996, our map would look like that. And if we combine both a fungicide, great fungicide, with a moderately resistant variety, the map of Ontario would have looked like this in 1996 had we had a moderately resistant variety and applied those fungicides that are available today and applied the right way and the right timing and whatnot. So our map would have looked like this if we had that in 1996 versus this, okay? So this is what we have today to work with, and I think we need to take advantage of this. So if we grow a susceptible variety, we're really relying a lot on our fungicide, maybe too much on our fungicide. In a lot of cases, if we rely too much on our fungicide, we spray a fungicide, sure, we get a really good reduction in DON toxin in a susceptible fungicide, but still, this might generate huge penalties at the elevator, okay? And then you say, well, I sprayed correctly at the right timing, I got the right fungicide, I did everything right, and I still got major reductions at the elevator, and I don't think anybody would be too happy if that worked out for you, right? But in a highly susceptible year, in a favorable year, that's when you need to take the pressure off of fungicides a little bit and include a bit more of the genetic resistance to Fusarium and combine that with a fungicide, then you have a great 1-2 punch in managing Fusarium head blight. All right, so any questions regarding this so far? Yep.
Now, why don't you take 4 varieties of high yielding? High yielding means that it's acceptable to the scale. And you take 4 varieties of low yielding that are exempt from scale, and you mix the 8 together and then plant them.
So the question was, could you mix, for instance, 4, you mentioned 4 varieties.
Varieties all together.
Yeah, 8 varieties.
Put them in the same field, mix them all together and plant them.
Well, you could do that. You could mix 8 varieties, 4 high yielding, you say, and then 4 low yielding, but the 4 low yielding could be resistant to Fusarium or whatever. Well, you could do that, but the challenge is that it's very difficult to time the heading all at once because they need to head all at the same time in order to optimize the fungicide timing. So if they head at different times, sure, you're spreading the risk out over a number of different weather systems that may pass through. But your fungicide timing, when do you apply your fungicide then, if some of your wheat heads at different timing relative to the other? Yeah.
But three fungicide applications closer together, most fungicides got, what, 15-day window. So if you do one, 15 days, 15 days, and 15 days, through the heading period, you should limit it all.
And so the comment was that most fungicides have a 15-day window. That is for maybe for leaf disease, but not for Fusarium head blight. Fusarium head blight, maybe at the most, like 6 days for Fusarium head blight. So that is her window. Not too many, like a lot of growers I know of, like are just really kind of struggle with applying one fungicide and applying it, like just one fungicide, rather than applying 3 all at the heading time. And plus that's off-label. You can't do that close in time. All right? So we could talk later about that. Number 4 is you have a fungicide. We have fungicides. Some of them, like Procero and Crumba, they're excellent fungicides, but they have to be applied at the right time. So application technology has increased. So I was directly involved in leading a lot of this research in applying those fungicides correctly. And so what we've done was to ensure coverage or detect coverage of the fungicide on the wheat head. So we have a vertical wheat head, and our goal is to apply a fungicide so each kernel around the wheat head is covered with fungicide, which is a huge challenge engineering-wise compared to applying a herbicide, let's say, on a flat leaf, because like that's fairly easy, like a flat fan nozzle. But when you talk about a head, a vertical head, and that you want panoramic coverage around that head. If a wheat kernel does not get coverage on the back side of that head, like no chemical on that wheat kernel, that's just like that head is not sprayed at all. And that kernel could be a source of infection. And that infection could spread to other kernels as well. So application technology is extremely important. And we still have quite a few growers in Ontario who are applying fungicides incorrectly, and then they complain to the chemical companies that their fungicides didn't do the job that they're supposed to do. Well, it could be, it's highly likely that it could be an application technology problem, and the research that we've done clearly shows that a lot of the fungicides are not applied uniformly on the wheat head. So flat fan nozzles are definitely out. But we tried a number of things, including aerial applications, and so this was taken about 1,000 feet up or so. We have strips of wheat right here, and so we use those strips as replicates, and this airplane was just kind of making its round here and going down each one of those strips in terms of replicates, right? And so this was taken, the plane was just rounding the headland here, and this was the boom on the plane. This must have been, I'm not sure whether this is a chopper or a plane, but we used a fixed wing and a chopper as well. And then we set these water-sensitive papers out. We kind of mimicked a wheat head, and we set these water-sensitive papers out in the field at about the same level as the canopy. And so then we can take these water-sensitive papers after the plane or sprayer has done its spray application, unfolded those papers, and then we scan those papers, and then we can say, well, which side or the front or the back didn't get coverage or was covered well. So we can detect the amount of coverage that a wheat head would get with these fungicides. So that's what we did. And so we looked at fixed wing and just noticed the different patterns here in the spray. So you think that, aerial application, it should be fairly uniform, but obviously these pictures clearly show that there's some areas, across the boom here, and especially along the ends, that maybe the application isn't as uniform as you think. And you notice some wind effects and some rotor effects right here. It also affects the spray pattern, and so we looked at that, and this is the result from some of that work. And so this is the swath position from the position on the boom. And so this is the back side coverage, this is the right side, front side, and left side. And so these kernels right here on the left side of the head, we would say that, hey, the coverage isn't as good as we think it should be on the left side. And then interesting, on the other side of the aircraft, we got excellent coverage on the left side here, and it was excellent coverage on the right side on the other side of the aircraft. So we have some variability in our coverage. So we looked at all of that. And so from a coverage standpoint, and then we looked at copper deposition, because some of the droplets are so small, we mix copper sulfate in with our spray test strips, and then we analyze those strips for copper, and then we can detect how much the actual chemical was applied on some of these water-sensitive papers. Because some of the droplet size, you know, with 4-gallon breaker, 3-gallon breaker with the aircraft, it's hard to see those droplets on water-sensitive paper, but we can detect. So in this case, we looked at the amount of copper that was deposited on the back, right, front, and left of these papers to get an idea of the coverage. And the copper coverage right here, they matched with the coverage that we could actually see, or the scanner saw with the coverage of the water-sensitive papers as well. So that really generated interesting data. It was a unique data set that I don't know of anybody else that has repeated that. We looked at various ground rigs as well, so backward, forward, backward only, and then the twin jet. And so this is a common nozzle, I think. Before this research was done, this was the recommendation on many of the labels to use a twin jet. And then some folks say that a forward-only turbo T-jet, that is the way to go. We also looked at a cone nozzle, then a T-jet duo nozzle, and then a twin cap. And then this is what we call an alternating turbo flood jet nozzle, so very coarse droplet size. Some of those, each nozzle, one nozzle is pointing forward, and the next nozzle on the boom is pointing, or this is pointing backwards, and the next nozzle is pointing forward, then back, forward, and so on and so forth. And these are turbo flood jet nozzles, very coarse droplet. And so we looked at that as well. So this is what the water-sensitive papers looked on each. So this is a forward-backward T-jet nozzle. So the nozzles are such that the spray pattern is about 15 degrees down from vertical, or from horizontal, I should say. And this is why the twin jet did not work, because those angles aren't as horizontal as what we like to see. So we got poor head coverage with the twin jet. But these nozzles are about 15 degrees from horizontal, and that produced very good coverage. So this is like a Cadillac design. And then we looked at this alternating turbo flood jet, which also produced very good coverage, and compare that with a twin jet, all at 20-gallon per acre, 12 miles an hour, and you can see that the twin jet had very much poor coverage compared to the forward back and the turbo flood jet. So the turbo flood jet is nice because it has one nozzle at each nozzle position on the boom, and this one, the forward backward, has two nozzles and some nozzle assemblies on like each 20 inches along the boom. So this is more expensive and it's harder to maintain because you just hit, maybe the boom might hit the canopy and it might change the nozzle configuration a little bit on the forward and back, whereas the turbo flood jet, they're pretty much a fixed nozzle, so they'll stay pointed either forward or backward, even though the boom might go into the wheat crop. It might break off, but at least it would stay to the forward and backward position. So this one is about half the price in terms of equipping the sprayer compared to this one. So this is the one that we've been recommending for about 6 or 7 years. Most of the agribusiness outlets in Ontario are using the turbo flood jet. And also there's quite a few researchers in Europe that have taken this research and they've modified their sprayer systems in Europe as well. So they've found some very good results using the turbo flood jet. So this is a turbo flood jet that I showed you. So the boom heights can affect coverage as well. So this is the ideal height for the backward forward flat fan, about 16 inches above the canopy. But as you know, you get some booms that are 90 feet wide, 120 feet wide, some rolling ground, and of course those booms have to be higher than 16 inches above the canopy, or unless if you don't do that, your booms are going to drag into the canopy a lot, and so most growers don't want that to happen, of course, and so they raise the boom up, and you can see that the amount of coverage is reduced by a half if the boom is increased by a half, or it's doubled, essentially. So this is 13 inches, backward, forward, flat fan, 16 inches above the canopy, and this was the coverage if it was 32 inches above the canopy, all right? So the backward and forward air induction, we tried that. Alternating turbo flood jet, we see the same practice as well. And then the twin jet. So the twin jet, ideally, 16 inches above the canopy or so. And then if we increase the boom height, that really poor coverage becomes even worse. And so the story here is that the best twin jet boom height was still not as good as a twice height kind of limit of these other more favorable designs here. All right? So obviously boom height is very important, and no one can set a boom 6, 8 inches or 16 inches above the canopy and expect to do a field that way. And automatic boom height controls, they can't respond to that quickly and to that precision either. It just becomes an extra challenge. And so that's why this boom height was looked at. So boom height is very important for spray drift. This was another result that came from our trials. It's just the effect that wind has. It's just amazing that wind has on the coverage. So we've had some single flat fan nozzles, and we went through the field and we expected these flat fan nozzles, like if the forward direction of the sprayer was like this, we would expect the front side of the heads to be very well covered, and then as the sprayer left those heads, we expected that curtain of spray to hit those heads, and then not much coverage on the back side. That's what we expected. But what we didn't expect was the effect of wind, and so the effect of wind is so great is that at 5 miles an hour wind speed, which is relatively calm, it didn't matter which direction your sprayer went, it always painted on the side where the wind was blowing against the heads. Right? So if you had a north wind, those heads will be very well covered on the north side of all those heads. And it didn't matter which direction your sprayer went or which direction the chopper or airplane went. So the effective wind speed is huge. And you can reduce the effective wind speed by keeping the droplets like as coarse as possible. Okay, and that's one of the advantages of the turbo flood jet design, because those flood jets produce very coarse droplets. And of course, drift is a concern as well. So many ask, okay, the coverage, what about DON reductions as well? And so this is the proportion of DON relative to untreated. So we have turbo flood jet, and so lower is better here. So compared to untreated, we have just over, in this case, we didn't get quite to that 50% control or reduction with the turbo flood jet nozzles. Twin jet didn't result in very much of a reduction, and then single T-jet only resulted in a 20% or less than 20% reduction in DON compared to an untreated check. So if your sprayer, the bottom line here is if your sprayer is equipped with T-jet nozzles, flat fan nozzles pointing straight down, you may as well just leave the sprayer parked in the shed and don't even bother spraying your wheat, because it'd be just a waste of time in terms of reducing Fusarium head blight or DON. Leaf disease control is still excellent, right? That may be a very big concern. But in terms of managing Fusarium head blight, already the fungicides are behind the 8 ball in terms of their efficacy on Fusarium head blight, and you want to make sure that the timing is right on, and also the application technology is right on. So many tend to blame the fungicide for not being as effective as it is, and the truth is that probably application technology here, it's at fault. That's the limiting factor. There's a question.
What is the ideal time?
Yeah, the ideal timing for applying Prosero or Carumba is, we usually say 50% flowering. That's the ideal timing, but the latest research from the US Scab Initiative and some of the work that we've done show these good fungicides, Prosero and Carumba, we can delay that application until 5 days, 6 days after 50% flowering or anthesis. And so still control is good, so that would be in the optimal window. So products like Folicure, they don't have that extended, so a Folicure kind of product, still I would aim for 50% anthesis time, flowering time. So you can go too early. So the work that the US Scab Initiative did shows that if you can apply too early, and that is not as good as applying a little bit on the late side. So a little bit on the late side, I'm saying, that 5 or 6, 7 days after 50% anthesis or flowering. Yeah.
What micron droplet size do you like to see?
So the micron droplet size, and so we're looking at a medium droplet kind of size in terms of our, if you had a flat fan oriented to the backward and forward approach, that's our Cadillac type system, and a medium droplet size is good for that. But in our flood jet nozzles, we can't produce, those do not produce a medium droplet size. Those are extra coarse. I can't put a number on that droplet size exactly. But those extra coarse droplets, they're more resistant to the wind effects that we've seen from our research versus the medium droplets. So I would tend to favor those turbo flood jets for a number of reasons, and that would be one of them. So number 5 would be a prediction model, and so most of you have seen these prediction models that can be used to make a decision whether to spray or not. A lot of sprayers are in high demand at this time of the year, right? For corn and soybean herbicide application, and you're busy, a lot of folks are busy, and that's one thing that you have to do is to spray your wheat at the right timing, and maybe you can make a decision, use these prediction models to help you push you off one side of the fence versus another, which job is more important. So that's where we use, and we use a different model than the Fusarium Head Blight Prediction Center one does, but both models, I think, have the same purpose, and that is help to make a fungicide application decision. And this is a model that we use in Ontario, and it just shows like the different DON toxin that's produced or predicted in these wheat crops relative to the heading day. And so we get the weather. These are 3 weather events or weather parameters centered around a heading day. So June 5th would be an example of, let's say, when wheat is headed June 5th, this is our prediction, DON prediction. So in this case, it was 7 parts per million. But if that wheat headed just a little bit earlier, we had DON predictions like below 2. It's just because that wheat is in a different phase of weather, right? Whether favorable or not favorable for disease. So heading date is very important, and to use these models and to update them every day is very important as well. And that's where you can use the heading date and the cultivar to also manage Fusarium head blight. And so we're getting into, this is number 6, a few more to go, but you can spread your risk of these favorable weather conditions by spreading out your heading date. So these are different cultivars that we have in our performance trials, and we have heading dates taken in these trials. And so our earliest trial has a heading date of, these are Julian days, like day 149 on the calendar. And then we have some of our later heading varieties in the same trial, same experiment, that had 8 days, 7 days later, right? Or 9 days later, I guess it is, okay? So you can spread out your risk. You can put all of your money in one basket and say, well, I planted one variety and they're all gonna head out the same day. Well, what if we were in this kind of situation, if all of your wheat headed out at this day? So if I wanted to spread my investment out, I would want to plant wheat that headed out maybe a little bit earlier and some a little bit later, just to spread that weather risk out. And we can do that by changing our wheat varieties as well, okay? And then in addition to changing the wheat varieties, we can kind of spread these heading dates out a little bit further. And this is number 7, just a short number 7, and that is that we can plant our earliest varieties first and our latest varieties last. And so that's another approach that we can use to spread these heading dates out a little bit more, because a 1 week delay in heading, 1 week delay in planting results in a 1 day delay in heading. Okay, so we can plant, if we can plant our earliest varieties first, they're gonna head out very early. And if we plant the later heading varieties last, we can spread out that window, that heading date window, by altering both the cultivar response to heading date and also the heading date in terms of planting. All right, so that's number 7. Number 8, combine cleanout, just very short. This is some of the work from Ohio State University. And we've done some similar work as well, but our work has not been published. But this work is very similar to our work as well. So a standard fan speed, we have Fusarium head blight or Fusarium damaged kernels here, 16% Fusarium damaged kernels. We increase the fan speed on the combine in severe wheat, and we can reduce that amount by about half, okay? So what's get infected after all of these Fusarium head blight management factors have occurred? You got some infection in your crop, and there's still a management opportunity here, and that's to blow most of those kernels or try to blow a lot of those infected kernels out the back end of your combine. In some situations, it's better than others, but at least it's an opportunity. So this is a kind of a neat one. This is number 9. So seed place starter fertilizer, okay, phosphorus. It's very important as well in terms of achieving a uniform heading out in your field. So if a wheat crop is deficient in phosphorus, it will delay in heading. It will have a delay in heading. Just like for corn. So corn, if you grew corn in a phosphorus deficient soil, soaking dates will be delayed. So maturity will be delayed. So that's why in a lot of starter fertilizer trials, the grain moisture tends to be a little bit lower, in corn trials. That's because phosphorus deficiencies delays development. And in this case, we have extremely variable, all fields are extremely variable in phosphorus, soil test P throughout the field. And so you have one area that could have a high soil test P, another area low soil test P, and those areas will head differently at different timing. And so, of course, the question is, how do you spray a field, like at 50% flowering, if one part of the field is not heading, and then another part of the field is at the optimum timing? It's like, what do you do? So we get that question all the time. And to reduce that variability in the field, you want to make it as uniform as possible. And one of the tricks to do that is to put down fertilizer phosphorus in furrow, right with the seed. If you broadcast that amount, you need 5 times as much fertilizer phosphorus to get that same response as an in-furrow application. So you need 5 times the fertilizer if you broadcast versus an in-furrow placement. So obviously in-furrow is very critical. So this is some of the long-term research. We have a long-term fertility experiments as well in Ontario, and this is part of it in wheat. So this is no in-furrow P versus in-furrow P, and this one yielded 18 bushel per acre less than this one. But this one, of course, we've seen pictures out in the field. So this is a field that's my neighbor. My neighbor does not apply the starter P with his wheat, and of course he gets all this heading variability and height throughout the field. So it's very difficult to spray that. So the fungicide's doing its job. You had the right application technology and whatnot, and then the wheat crop looks something like that. And so when is the right time to spray? And then we get some other symptoms of phosphorus deficiency. So again, this is another field that didn't have that seed place phosphorus. And then you see what we call the corn row syndrome in the wheat. And so this is where the wheat was planted on top of old corn rows with a starter fertilizer application. And those wheat plants, of course, are heading much earlier than those other wheat plants that do not have that starter fertilizer phosphorus between the rows. And so again, when do you spray? When do you spray this for a Fusarium fungicide? Because these plants right here, they may not be flowering for another 10 days, whereas these plants right here, where it's responding to phosphorus, they may be flowering, they may be at the perfect timing. So this also puts our Fusarium head blight management strategy at risk if we do that. So just on the side, just the benefit of seed place phosphorus. So this is work that the former wheat cereal specialist, Peter Johnson, he put this together over the years between 2010 to 2013. And so I had a metric scale on here in tons per hectare. And so just for you guys, I converted it to yield a bushel per acre last night. So I just did it just for you guys. No, seriously, all of us, even Ontario, we usually use the bushels per acre. So this was a needed thing on this graph. But here's a soil test phosphorus here, and this is a yield response according to that soil or P applied with the seed in furrow, just at 52 pounds per acre. So that's 100 pounds per acre of MAP. So in furrow, according to the soil test. And so we have a soil test of 13 parts per million. We can expect about an 8 bushel yield increase here. Soil test levels get below 10 parts per million. Then we have yield responses, according to this data set, 15, 18 bushel per acre, which is huge. That would easily pay for the MAP fertilizer that was invested here. And believe it or not, most people take soil tests throughout the field, 50, 100 acre chunks. And you would not believe the variability of the soil test phosphorus throughout the field. Like you've heard, like you know, precision ag and whatnot, and making grid marks throughout the field and taking soil samples throughout the grids. Well, soil test phosphorus can vary highly, just a few meters apart in the field. So it's very difficult to make precision ag soil phosphorus pay. But a seed-placed fertilizer would take into account a lot of areas in the field at a very small, high-resolution grid. They would make those areas respond more up in these areas, whereas maybe your soil test values might be here. A lot of pockets in the field might be in this kind of area in response. And that's why we tend to see huge yield increases with soil test phosphorus. And we also see, of course, advantages of uniform heading. So, yeah.
You say mix it with a seed. If I'm following you right, I'm mixing fertilizer right in my seed box when I drill, or I got to get some other boxes and tubes and air to it?
Well, the question was, how do you put the phosphorus with the seed? And so we have, like I'm in a debate, I still farm with my father, right? And so he's 80-something. And so he says that there is no way that I'm going to put fertilizer and seed, mix it together and put it through the drill. He says, there's no way, so you're not going to do it. So he won't let me do it because he's worried about corrosion and whatnot. But we have a lot of growers in Ontario who are mixing the seed and MAP fertilizer, mixing it together so their agribusiness does it for them, and then they just put that into the drill. It's a little bit more difficult. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so some growers do that. Other growers have, capabilities in their air drills and whatnot to apply fertilizer and seed separately. And so that is a good way to.
Let's say I go to my fertilizer dealer. I just take my seed wheat with me and say, put her in a blender with the fertilizer, blend her up, put her back on the wagon.
Yeah, exactly. Just the agribusiness will do that. So the agribusiness will, in Ontario at least, I'm not sure. If you presented the idea, this new idea to some agribusiness, they would say, maybe some would say, oh, I don't have time for that. That's nonsense. Like, what are you talking about? But a lot of agribusinesses in Ontario will do that. Yeah. Yeah. So it requires extra work, but the dividends, the payback to this is very important. So the yields are the yield responses here are very strong, right? And also the uniformity of heading date is such a critical thing, Fusarium head blight management. I think that is a very important thing to do, all right? So on my drill at home, I'm still like, I'm in business with my father, so I have to, make my business partner happy, because I do a lot of work off the farm as well, so I need to keep him happy. So we have just a liquid fertilizer applicator on a drill that we just inject the liquid with the seed, and it does accomplish a lot of the same benefits as a dry wood, a little bit more expensive. So number 10 is harvest early and pay for drying. So we didn't do this in 1996. And a lot of the older folks, they say, well, you have to let your wheat dry in the field, like you don't want to pay drying costs. But the risk associated with leaving your crop in the field, we all know that, what the risk is in terms of getting bad weather, especially with white wheat and whatnot. That potential there out in the field is just too great of a risk. And so it'll definitely pay to dry, harvest early, and then pay for the little bit of drying costs. Another thing to dry, just a few short ones here. Dry wet grain quickly to 13%. We've seen loads of wheat, at 18% moisture taken off wet, left in the wagon even overnight or in a day, and then the DON toxin will increase, like a rocket. Okay, so you need to get that as dry as possible. No bin air drying kind of thing. It can't dry the grain fast enough. It will increase the toxin in your wheat. So on-farm storage of contaminated grain is important as well, so we can ship off season. So that's what I did. I do that when I harvest grain off my farm, and maybe the fusarium levels are maybe concerning in my wheat. So what I'll do is just store it at my grain elevator, and then I'll ship it during February or March. And the marketers don't seem to look at the wheat, as closely for some reason in February or March for fusarium, and so I'll get in trouble for saying that, but I might shoot myself in the foot by saying that. That's right, but it seems to work. In Ontario, we have a sliding grade discount for Fusarium damaged kernels and DON. So the future here is maybe there might be a premium for ultra low DON grain, so the toxin and grain. So if you can deliver ultra low DON toxin grain, maybe there's a premium for that. Because right now, we're not given a premium. Growers aren't given a premium for ultra low contaminated wheat, like a high quality wheat. Like we don't have a premium for that. And I think that's the same situation in the US as well. And better detection technologies, especially at the elevator. So some of those technologies are getting better and better to detect how much toxin is in a load of grain at the elevator, delivered to the elevator. So just a few conclusions. Reduce the reliance on fungicides using integrated pest management. And so these top 13 tips, like I think fungicide might be involved in a few of those, but we need to think of an integrated approach more than just relying on one factor. Reduce risks, so we need to manage the risks, and we need to include a moderately susceptible or moderately resistant cultivar, include a variety, but we need to include some cultural practices and harvest timing to make that fusarium risk low. And for variety development, of course, yield is king, and I've fallen into a mistake by overlooking at some of the other variety characteristics and just choosing a variety based on yield. And so we also, and just a little leftover from the last presentation, intensification of small grain cereal production is necessary, and we need to do this. We need to be thinking of different ways to encourage wheat production. And a Fusarium head blight is one of the things that we need to manage to encourage more wheat production. All right? So with that, if there are any questions, I'm not sure what our time, if we have some time or not, but I'd be glad to take any questions. Yeah, question over here.
Growth regulators.
Oh, growth regulators. Yes, I have. I've looked at some growth regulators, a lot of the growth regulators that we choose that we've experimented with. I haven't done a lot just recently, but some in the few years ago that I looked at did not show, none of them showed a yield response, an increased yield if the wheat stood. And so we only saw a yield response if the wheat started to lodge, okay? And so there's new information, of course, there's new growth regulators being registered all the time, and some of the new ones are just, I think they need some more research. And so this year especially, we have wheat that's at a high risk in terms of lodging. And so this year, I think it'd be a good year to experiment with some growth regulators, if you can manage that growth regulator and maybe some of the registration or some of the restrictions on that in your wheat crop. So this is the year to try out those growth regulators, I think. All right? Yeah.
What moisture do you like to see it harvested?
Yeah, what moisture do I like to see wheat harvested at? So it depends on a lot of factors. So on my farm, like I have a fairly big combine for the wheat acreage that I have. So I don't tend to harvest too wet, but I know that some growers, they have a lot more wheat than what their combine capacity is. And in those cases, for those growers, 18%, 19%, that's where they start at in terms of harvesting. Yeah. Yep. All right.
Where you showed the difference in growth and the head development, you'll find where the head is retarded, it's like right now, if you go out in the wheat field, and if there's any low spot and water standing there, that's going to be retarded. So you got to start at the basement first and pattern tile the field at every 25 to 30 feet to eliminate the problem you're talking about with the phosphate and have an uneven.
Yeah, so the comment was about the field variability in the heading. There's other factors involved with that variability in heading as well. And so the comment was regarding low spots, poorly drained areas in the field, or maybe just poor soil conditions, and those factors also contribute to the variable heading, so we need to consider those. So tile drainage is probably the number one improvement that one can be made on a farm, and so that's very important. I think there was a, okay, yep.
That seems to be something that when they test for it, it's awful ununiform, so to speak. Are they getting better tests on that so that we know that if we get hit, let's say with a 3 or 4% amount of toxin, that that's what it is? Or just too many times go take a load, you get hit with high bomb toxin, you go to the elevator next door,
Yeah.
and they're bringing our load, they say they don't find no bomb toxin.
That's right. It's the most frustrating thing is getting an accurate measurement of vomitoxin or fusarium damage kernel counts. It just depends on, what kernels are included in that. Just one infected kernel could send the whole test out of whack, right? And so some better detection technologies are available now, are coming on stream. There's some that I can't talk about, but the future looks really good for accurate detection technology in terms of evaluating a load to see what a load is in terms of the toxin levels or fusarium and Blight damage, the damaged kernels. So there was another hand up here somewhere, I think. Oh, yeah, over here.
You were talking about the phosphorus.
Yeah.
What about 1034O versus MAP?
And for the phosphorus, so 1034O versus MAP.
Yeah.
And so those phosphorus are equivalent sources. So we have not seen any differences at all between those two. Yeah, liquid has its advantages, absolutely. But it depends on, like the liquid would be a little bit more expensive, per unit of nutrient. So you have to balance that out. I have the same situation on my home farm. Yeah.
Are you starting to see elevators that are willing to take 20% wheat and dry it and only charging you for shrink in Ontario?
Yeah, I can't really answer that question. So the question was, have we seen elevators take 20% wheat and only charge us for shrink, right? And then drying charges, right? There would be.
No drying charge.
I haven't seen any elevators do that in Ontario.
We're starting to see that in Indiana. We're starting to have a lot of elevators that are going to that because they want the quality.
Yes.
And we're also looking at milling companies that are. We have one now that's willing to take it up to 23% and dry it for you and only charge you shrink. So that's a real positive in getting it out early and not letting it set.
Yeah, it's huge difference. And so, the buyers want quality wheat. And so a lot of buyers are getting very frustrated because when wheat comes in, it's dry, but the quality isn't as good. That wheat, nothing good happens to a wheat crop or cereal crop or soybean crop or corn. Once it reaches physiological maturity, the quality just goes downhill. And so right at that physiological maturity time, that is the most quality time, right, compared to what its future would be like. And so if it can be harvested earlier without that big of a penalty, usually it works good for both the industry and the grower as well. So we're probably moving into that as well, but I haven't heard any elevators in my area at least charging nothing for 20% wheat. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, one over here.
Have you done any research in regards to the tiller counts per, let's say, square foot or square yard? Having that addressed in measuring application?
And so the question was, have we addressed, is there some kind of relationship between tiller counts and the way we manage nitrogen application? And so usually if we have a fairly low tiller count or no tillers, if we just have the primary stem, due to late wheat planting, we try to encourage tillering, or at least to maintain just very few tillers, so 0 to 1 tiller. We want to maintain those tillers. Those tillers are very important because those tillers they can contribute to yield, right? They can send up and produce a head. So you want to maintain those tillers. And so what you want to do in those situations, an early nitrogen application at greenup. And so I've heard that this morning, nitrogen application at greenup, that becomes the most important thing to do, okay? That early nitrogen application at greenup, and then maybe delay the majority of your nitrogen until later on, just before corn planting. But that first early shot of nitrogen, 30 pounds of the acre of nitrogen is very important for wheat that has just a few tillers, okay? Because you want to preserve that. But if a wheat, on the other hand, if you have some early planted wheat or wheat that has let's say 5 or 6 tillers per plant. That's a way more tillers than what the plant can effectively manage. It essentially makes the whole plant a little bit weaker if it has more tillers to support. And so ideally, we should have between 2 and 3 tillers going into the winters. That's ideal. If we have 4 or more, that means that the wheat plant, like we should encourage that wheat plant to get rid of at least some of the weaker tillers, and we can do that by delaying our nitrogen application. So a nitrogen application at green up is not a good idea, okay, with wheat that has 4 or more tillers. We need to wait as long as possible for that nitrogen application, right before corn planting, right when the busiest season starts. And that wheat crop, it might begin to yellow a little bit with nitrogen deficiency, but that wheat crop is really thinning itself with excess tillers, and that wheat crop will produce just as much yield, but it'd be at a lower risk, much lower risk in terms of lodging. Okay?
So have you done that though in like a square foot, so you can actually count the tillers in a square foot?
Yeah, so for the tiller count, so we just simply uproot some wheat plants and then just take an average of tiller numbers on wheat plants. Yep. Right? So a split application of nitrogen becomes even more important, I think, when you have a lot of tillers to manage. Back here. Oh, there's one question back here. Yeah.
On the nitrogen, when you say holding up until corn planting time, and weather goes in cycles, and there's times when you get into a dry spring, and you might go 2-3 weeks without hardly any rainfall, and you can get volatilization at that time. Don't you worry about that? That's one reason why I always like to put it on a little early to make certain that the rain gets nitrogen down to the root system.
Yeah, very good. So some years are talking about, some years are very early years. You thinking about getting your corn in, like that should be the #1 priority. And if you don't have your nitrogen on by the time you start planting corn, right, then maybe your nitrogen might not get timed properly for your wheat then, if you're into corn already. But there's a trade-off. So in every management decision, there's a trade-off, right? And so if you put all of your nitrogen on as per usual at green up, a lot of our research studies show that it's just a recipe for a high-risk lodging situation. So maybe just some of your nitrogen on at that time if you have to, and that will broaden the window of when you can put that next extra bigger amount of nitrogen on, maybe after you finish corn. So you can put some on a little bit early. You can do that, and that just broadens the window in terms of when that second nitrogen application can be applied. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but yeah.
Do you put any micronutrients on when you do your first application of nitrogen?
So we don't put any micronutrients on, no. So we've done a few studies showing that, and none of them have really panned out very good in terms of micronutrient response. And so sulfur is not a micronutrient, right? Sulfur is a macronutrient. So sulfur, we see very consistent responses with sulfur, like 10 pounds, 15 pounds of the acre of sulfur. That's our standard practice now. And so we usually put that on with our first nitrogen application. Yep. Yep, sulfur on the first nitrogen application. So the sulfur acts like nitrogen in a way, so sulfur it can be leached out. So if you put on sulfur in the fall, like most of that sulfur would not be available for the crop in the springtime. And so you want to put that sulfur on when that wheat crop can take it up and use it the most, and that would be on the first application usually. So if that wheat crop is deficient of sulfur, there's a chance that yields will be reduced. But if you can reduce, when that sulfur deficiency occurs in wheat, if you can reduce the chance of that happening, you'll have consistently high wheat yields. And so if you apply it with your first application, there's a good chance that sulfur won't be deficient throughout the entire wheat producing cycle, wheat growth cycle. So there's another question over here. Yeah.
Done any research when you're spraying whatever power in nitrogen?
And so the question was, can we put a little bit of nitrogen in with our fungicide at flowering? And the very quick answer to that is no, that is not, we've done research with that, and that is highly not advisable to put nitrogen in with our fungicide application at flowering timing. So flowering timing, obviously, our main objective, primary objective, uniform head coverage. Well, that's not a very good absorption site for nitrogen. And plus, we're thinking about putting it on heads that have very delicate flower structure. So we're talking about putting a salt solution on extremely delicate anthers and stigmas. And of course, I think it's just setting yourself up for a disaster and yield reductions if you put nitrogen on with your fungicide. But you can make separate applications on, and so our hard red wheat acreage, if we want a bump in protein, what we'll do usually is put maybe 30 pounds to the acre on of 28%, stream it on the leaves, like with streamer nozzles, not flat fan nozzles, stream it on and then dilute it with like a 1-to-1 solution of water, and then put it on later in the day, not early in the morning, to reduce the leaf burn. So we might do that for hard red, but it's a separate application to the fungicide application. And all the data that I showed before this morning about fungicide and nitrogen, that synergy, those were separate applications, that they were not mixed together or anything like that. So you don't want to mix fungicide or nitrogen. I can't think of a good example at any time. Maybe in corn, like there's some research that, there's some products you can mix your foliar fungicide for corn with a nitrogen product, but we haven't seen very good results with that product either. For wheat, I haven't seen any results, positive results with that. Yes?
A couple more things about nitrogen stabilization, and then if you caught any wind up your way about the Lake Erie bloom, Nosy bloom.
Yeah, so 2 questions really, and I'll address the last one first, I guess. So the algae bloom in Lake Erie, so we have very strict, I think the most popular presentations now in Ontario this past winter have been phosphorus management strategies to reduce the runoff. Just 1 pound per acre of active phosphorus is producing this huge problem that we have in our Great Lakes. And so what we need to do is make sure that we do not broadcast phosphorus in the fall and not work it in at least anyway. And so this in-furrow application of phosphorus, that is the best way, most efficient way for the wheat plant or the corn or soybeans or whatever to absorb that phosphorus, and also it reduces the runoff, phosphorus runoff the most. But broadcast applications of phosphorus, like I know in Ontario, we hear that the government is going to legislate a ban against broadcasting phosphorus in the fall. That we just can't do it. It'll be illegal to do that. Hopefully it doesn't come down to that, but the government is talking about doing that. All right, and then the first question was, could you remind me? Oh, the nitrogen stabilization.
Or acridine or, in your regular fertilizer.
Yeah, so nitrogen stabilization, so we looked at those and ESN as well, especially in our hard red wheat production, because that protein response to nitrogen is due to mainly nitrogen uptake during the grain fill. So an earlier application of nitrogen, we want that nitrogen to be around by the time that wheat needs it, to make protein. And so we've looked at, a lot of the research in Ontario has looked at, those nitrogen stabilizers and ESN in hard red wheat. And it does show an increase. We do see a protein response in hard red wheat. So the stabilizers in soft red and soft white, it shows variable results. And so some of the stabilizers show that the nitrogen will be kept available from uptake of the plant if we use the wrong stabilizer product. So if we reuse the wrong stabilizer product, and ESN also has this problem as well, because we don't really know exactly, it depends on soil conditions, soil contact with ESN, when that nitrogen will be released to the crop. And if it turns dry out, those granules can sit on the top of the soil surface, for the ESN can sit on the top of the soil surface for months, and that nitrogen will not be available, right, if it turns dry out. And so it's just that variability in when that nitrogen become available to the crop, and that crop needs to take it up, and if it's taken up at the wrong time, some of our yields have shown significant reductions because of this, like the ESN not being released at a good time. So some of the other products, so if we apply, say, UAN 28% on a wet surface, and so in that situation, if the weather forecast is like no rain in the forecast, we dribble on 28%, you know, at green up or whenever, and as our second split application right before corn planting, and the soil surface is fairly wet and damp, usually it would pay to put a nitrogen stabilizer on, like Agritane or something like that, just to reduce that volatilization. And that will give you a window, you know, hopefully the rain will wash it in and then the nitrogen can be taken up by the plant. So that is usually a good investment. Yep.
Study showed on 50/50 mixture on nitrogen on that green up time.
Yeah, so
Stabilizer and
that's right. So I talked about the risk of using ESN, and that is if you use, let's say, ESN without mixture of any other product. But a mixture, let's say a 50/50 mixture of urea and ESN, so that will broaden your window and reduce that risk of that the nitrogen within the ESN won't be available.
because I was reading, they're depending on when you spread it, when you want to do 50/50.
Yeah, so 50/50 mix would reduce that risk. So, yeah, in our studies show that in high loss situations, so very wet soils, warm soils, wet a long period of time, we get most of our nitrogen loss is due to denitrification, but on clay soils, but on sandy soils, we have more leaching loss. And so if we have, very wet weather, we tend to see a bigger response if we have, let's say, a nitrogen stabilizer within that mix. But a lot of the times, in most field situations, we have been unable to show a significant yield response or better nitrogen use efficiency with a nitrogen stabilizer product. So in some situations, I'm sure it works, and you can strategize, you can pull all the data together and say, hey, we're in a high loss situation here, we better pay a little bit extra and stabilize that nitrogen to protect that nitrogen. So we're also looking at, instead of split application nitrogen, why not put a nitrogen stabilizer on that nitrogen and just apply it early? And so that is another, I guess, strategy that you can use. We don't have a lot of data with that strategy. Yep.
If your wheat crop is moist, say from a dew, is it more or less likely to have leaf burn with streamers and UAN?
So the question was about leaf burn, and so when would be maybe what conditions would promote the most leaf burn? And that would promote the most leaf burn when you have the fast evaporation and drying rates of dew in the morning. So that would be the worst time to apply a UAM, let's say, product, be the first thing in the morning. The best timing, if you had to choose one, would be maybe after supper or something like that, or after 4 o'clock. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? I have one question here.
Have you stabilized liquid nitrogen with a humic acid or a sugar?
So have we stabilized liquid nitrogen with a humic acid or sugar? So no, we haven't looked at those products. We've looked at humic acid in terms of a seed treatment, as an in-furrow treatment, as a foliar application. And so I don't have any good news to report in those studies, other than there were no yield responses. Okay, maybe we were doing it wrong, I don't know, but we have had a lot of trials out, and none of them showed any yield response, like 0 or 0.1. Okay?
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, thanks.